guys, I'm Everest. Marco is behind the camera, and we are doing a video on the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening involved a lot of religious free will and concepts like universal salvation, which was different from the First Great Awakening, right? These things did not really agree with the First Great Awakening's major religion was Calvinism, which preached predestination, which meant that when you're born, you're either predestined to go to heaven or go to hell. And speaking of religion, right, there are many different religious groups, and here we'll talk about them. We weren't being very clear, so just to clarify at the start that the Second Great Awakening had topics of universal salvation and religious free will. And in comparison to Calvinism, which that preached that you're born going to heaven or hell, right? Religious free will and universal salvation meant that anybody, through living virtuously, could go to heaven, right? And that is just one of the primary things that was evident in the Second Great Awakening.
And within the religious revival, there was the revival of the Protestant church within America. And under the Protestant church, it included the Baptists, the Methodists, and Congregationalists. This meant that there was an influx of new members. And under also religious revival, there was the formation of other religions, such as the Mormons, founded by Joseph Smith, and the Shakers, founded by Ann Lee. And all this religious revival was through the westward expansion, which we'll go on to later.
So speaking of westward expansion, of course, with the rest of the United States, the religions would also spread westward, and they would do it through revivals. And revivals there are two different kinds of revivals. There were urban revivals, and there are also camp meetings. Urban revivals, of course, happened in more urban areas and within cities. Churches would be set up and people would go there. And the difference between these two is that camp meetings, as the name suggests, is that people would go long distances and they'd be expected to camp out, right? Like there's some sources that say it'd be over 30 miles. People would go 30 plus miles, right, to go camp out for days, weeks even, and there's thousands of people there. There'd be singing, dancing, preaching, this and that. And these are some of the methods that these religions are able to spread westward.
And some of the consequences from the Second Great Awakening were both women's rights and abolition movements, which are both connected from the universal salvation, a very important part of the Second Great Awakening. If anyone could join any religion, that would mean they were both equal, which is very important in women's rights and abolition movements. Some of the very important figures within women's rights were Lucretia Mott, and there was also Abigail Adams, who famously wrote in her letter to John Adams to not forget about women. And from the women's rights, it would lead to women's suffrage and the development of women's suffrage. Also, this also led to more abolition movements. And if they were all equal, that means slavery was bad and very not advocated for under the Second Great Awakening.
Another important part of the abolitionist movements is the difference between the North and the South. In the North, right, abolitionist movement was popular. There's all these religions supporting it, right? But in the South, they weren't big on the Second Great Awakening, a lot because if they were big on the Second Great Awakening, that would mean that they supported universal salvation, everyone is able to go to heaven, right? That means everyone's equal, and they had slavery, right? If they had slaves, supporting this would contradict themselves, right? And so these guys were not big fans. Another big consequence is the temperance movement. The temperance movement was the movement of all these religions that were against things like, they were against the use of drugs, alcohol being one of those, and also being celibate, those types of things. And the temperance movement eventually led into the Prohibition Acts that were extremely unpopular, as it would limit the amount of alcohol people could have, and eventually they were repealed.